My name is Martin Fahy and I'm the CEO of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. Thank you for joining us on what's a rather inclement evening in Sydney. We've been looking forward to this event for many years, and I'm delighted that we are joined today by members of the board of the Ramsay Centre. And this is something which, when I spoke to my predecessor earlier this evening, has been in process from probably 2018, I think, was the initial engagement. And it really reflects the fact that the 5 years in the making has been the results of the challenges caused by COVID, the commitments that our speakers had to obviously deliver and bring content to a huge worldwide audience. And so we were, over that period of time, however, been very fortunate that Professor Hughes agreed to record a number of really engaging and very insightful lectures with Simon Haynes. And I'd like to acknowledge Simon for all of the work that he did that and for making her visit possible. And we are delighted to get it over the line. Events like this, as many of you who are regular Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization attendees would know, it's not possible without the amazing generosity of our benefactor, Paul Ramsay. I think he would have liked all our events, that goes without saying, but he would have particularly liked tonight's event. I think it would have resonated with him very, very much. So no pressure on our speaker. But I think this is one he would have left work early. He would have got the copy of the book, and I think he would have enjoyed having you here very, very much. So thank you for coming, and very, very welcome here. We are very honoured to welcome and have an award-winning historian, author, and broadcaster. Some might say the David Attenborough of history and the ancient world. Her understanding of the topic has meant that she's not just here for this event, but she's here for a number of engagements with the centre this week. So we have tonight's lecture. Tomorrow we have a masterclass with our Ramsay scholars, undergraduate scholars in Sydney. She then makes her way to Brisbane, where she'll again deliver a masterclass to our scholars on the UQ Western Civilization program. And then we have a public lecture at the Customs House. And so all of that, I think, means that she's had a very busy schedule here. She's been very, very patient with us and very, very generous with her time from that point of view. Tonight, Professor Hughes will be talking about digging up history, the journey that she has taken and that she's taken on behalf of all of us through the really extraordinary archaeological sites around the world. For those of you who've had a chance to watch the series, she's made a large number of documentaries on the BBC, Channel 4, PBS, National Geographic, SBS, ABC, the Discovery and the History channels. And she's been engaged quite extensively with the media here. And I know she's got exciting things planned. I think we've managed, along with Adrian, to seduce her with the delights of Sydney. And we are planning, if we can't keep her here, we're planning at least to get her back very, very soon. She's been honoured, I think, on numerous occasions. Her appointment as a professor at New College of Humanities, a research fellow at King's College London, awards such as the Medlicott Medal for Services to History, Europe's Cultural History Prize, and an OBE for Services to History. She has an extensive body of published work. The Seven Wonders of the Ancient World, which was a Sunday Times bestseller and longlisted for the Anglo-Hellenic League Runciman Award 2025. Venus and Aphrodite, History of a Goddess, also shortlisted. Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, a Sunday Times bestseller and shortlisted again for Runciman Award. The Hemlock Cup, Socrates, Athens and the Search for the Good Life, a New York Times bestseller and shortlisted for the Writers Guild Award. And Helen of Troy, Goddess, Princess, Whore, which has been translated into 10 languages. If you'd like to refresh the copy of any or all of those books, they are available tonight. We would encourage you to do so from that point of view. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a wonderful pleasure to have Professor Hughes here, and I know you'll join me in giving her a very warm Sydney welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Bettany Hughes.
Hello. How delightful to be here. Thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. And what a beautiful place it is, and how fantastic to be here with you in person. I was doing an ABC radio interview this morning, and one of the questions that they said is, you know, is it very dull and lonely being a historian? And I said, well, neither of those things. It's definitely not dull, and it's not lonely, because for me, I feel as though I'm surrounded by people all the time. They happen to all be dead, but in my mind they are alive. But that is where I live in my head, is mainly in the Bronze Age and the classical world. So again, it's just such a pleasure to be in a room full of the living tonight. And also very appropriate, because the kind of question that I've been asked to ask is a very vivid and vital one, which is, what is the point of history? What is the value of history in this fast-changing, ever-evolving world? And I want to really briefly, just in the time that we have, try to answer that by referring to some of the journeys and adventures that we've been having through the archaeological past, because it feels that this is a question with real bite now. One of the greatest historians from the 20th century said that we were in a real danger of living in a permanent present. And I think it can feel like that, particularly now that actually our tool of historical record, the thing that helps us record history, is the smartphone. And when we record history, it seems that we're not actually even in the moment. We're capturing a slice of time and then immediately sharing that. And I should just say, I am absolutely not a technophobe. I love technology. I love it partly because it comes from an ancient Greek word, and you know, I love anything to do with ancient Greece, so you'll probably know that techne is a word that meant a kind of know-how, a sort of wisdom. It was actually a word that preceded the idea of philosophy. It was a way of operating in the world. And then if you look at tech, its origins right the way back in Proto-Indo-European. Tech means a weaving together. It's something that allows us to stay together as a society. So at its very best, technology should be able to do that. It should enhance our potential as a thinking species. But we do have an issue in that history is often viewed as somehow in a kind of different continent to technology. So I'm asked a lot, what is the point of history? And I've always got these kind of very pat answers. You know, I say that history allows us access to a reservoir of truth and ideas, that surely the pursuit of the sum total of human experience is a beneficial thing to do, that in a slightly more granular way, if we study history, we understand how to study data, we understand how to analyse opinion, how to make judgments about authenticity, ever more important now. It gives us an amazing foundation of current geopolitics. So I can say all of these things, but I'm sometimes aware that they just sound like kind of passionate platitudes. You know, of course I'm going to say that. But luckily now we have science on our side, ladies and gentlemen in the room, who I think by the fact you've turned up probably quite like history. Because scientists now tell us that we are creatures of memory, physically, physiologically. That if you think of memory, it's not that memory exists in a kind of chest of drawers somewhere in our brain that we can pull out and then pop back in again at will. Memory exists right across our brains as a system in what's called the default mode network. And it's a really interesting network of synaptic connections, this. So the default mode network is where we hold memory. It's also where we hold a sense of self and identity, and it's also where imagination is found. So the truth is, we cannot have a future thought unless we access a memory of some kind. And that might be a word, an idea, a visual memory, an experience. But we have to have memory in order to create ideas about what's ahead of us. So if we deny history, it's not just that we're denuding the past, it's not just that we're etiolating our present, it's that we're physically cauterizing our possibilities as a species. So as I said, it's fantastic now that we know scientifically memory matters. And it's something that linguists have been pointing out to us for a long time as well. You're a very cultured audience, I can tell. You probably all know that the word history, again, is an ancient Greek word, historiae, that means rational inquiry. And it means rational inquiry not just about the past, but about the present and about the future. And I think, again, probably everybody in this room agrees, we need rational inquiry ever more urgently now in this world of fake news, where it's very hard for us to discern what is true and what is false. So rational inquiry it's a tool. History isn't a thing, it's a process. And then if you look at how the word history evolves in Latin, historia is more about narrative, about storytelling. So history is rational inquiry that is then shared in an accessible and a relevant way. And again, this really helps us because we are a storytelling species. We understand the world and ourselves by the stories that we tell about it and that we tell about others. And for me, it's fantastic when I look back to archaeology because I see that this is something which appears right at the very birth of the modern mind. So I'm talking between around 70,000 and 40,000 years ago. So just look at this lovely fella. I adore him or her or it, whoever it is. So this is the so-called lion-headed human. Interestingly, when it was first discovered in 1939 in the Swabian Alps, in what's now Germany, just above the river Danube, he was branded the lion-headed man because you found it was men finding images of men then. It's around 31 centimetres high, made of mammoth ivory, 40,000 years old. And we know from all the archaeology at this time that humans are absolutely capable of fashioning photoreal versions of the world around them. So they can create perfect horses, perfect images of the tools they're using, perfect replicas of species of tree. But whoever made this, and it probably took about 370 hours to create this, at a time when life is tough, you know, when you've got wild beasts around, there's a real issue with food. Somebody took time out of their difficult, hard-pressed days to create this as a kind of storybook fantasy version of humankind. And we don't know what he or she or they represents, but it's clearly something which is trying to understand the possibilities of the world, the possibilities of imagination. And I see this time and time again in the journeys that I make through all continents. I had a really exciting moment about 2 years ago when I was on the southern borders of Turkey, very, very close to Syria. And I turned up late at night and we were making a film. And I thought, I just got a hunch. I've just got an instinct. There might be something else to find here. So I managed to find somebody who had a contact of the mayor. And I managed to get the mayor to put me in contact with some local officials. I've actually realised, literally as I'm telling this, that my husband's in the room and he doesn't know this story. But anyway, it was completely irresponsible of me. So I went out late at night on my own in this small town in southern Turkey and ended up, you know, in a cafe drinking tea with 4 men in black. With not much, they didn't have much English, and my Turkish is sort of pretty ropey. So we were trying to communicate, and I said, look, is there anything, have you discovered anything new? I also didn't have phone signal. I do remember thinking, I'm doing everything I would tell my daughters not to do at this point. Is there anything new? And they said, yes. Well, there's a farmer in the next door village who found a Stone Age storyboard would you be interested in seeing it? So, of course, I went, yes, I would. And we completely rechanged the schedule. And this is the storyboard. I'm sorry, because it's the definition isn't fantastic, but it's because we were taking photos on our iPhone really quickly. So what you're looking at here is 11,000 years old. You got access to it. The poor man whose cellar it was in has no idea what had hit him. So he was basically kind of extending his cellar in order to stack bottles of lemonade that he was hoping to sell in the local kiosk, and sort of came across this thing. And thank goodness didn't cover it up, went and told the authorities. And you get to it kind of through a yard that's got, you know, goats and chickens and dogs. And walk into it, and it goes all around the edge of the room. What you can see here is obviously a man who's hunting. He's confronting a bull, but this isn't just any old bull. This is a now extinct form of prehistoric bull called the auroch, which was enormous, which stood about 1.4 meters high at the shoulder, so a huge beast. And behind him, you can just see the back end of a big cat. And this lecture is actually being recorded and I think is then being put on YouTube. So I've decided I can't show you the next slide, but you can come and see me afterwards, because just along you also have a man who's holding his erect penis in his hand. And he's looking really happy about what's going on. So again, we can imagine, you know, this story, but it is an extraordinary thought, isn't it? That this is, as I said, 11,000 years ago. So this is 6,500 years before the pyramids. And people in this society, which is supposed to be before we had kind of proper settled cities, are sharing their idea of the world in literally like a cartoon storyboard along the wall. And you find this elsewhere in Turkey too. So what you're looking at here is around 9,000 years old from the proto-city of Çatalhöyük. It's about 100 miles kind of further inland to Turkey. And you get a lot of these prehistoric figurines of women from around this time. And I've had really interesting conversations when I've been here in Sydney. I love your feminism, Sydney. And just a little kind of sidebar of information. If you look at all of the human figurines that are created between around 40,000 BCE and around 4,000 BCE, over 90% of them are of the female form. So make of that what you will, but it shows us that women were very definitely present in the minds of those early societies. But this one's a little bit unusual because often those figurines are very evidently fecund and fertile. So like you see on the left, big breasts, kind of swelling pregnant bellies, beautiful fat thighs. But if you turn this figurine around, you can see that the flesh is melting away from her bones and she's becoming a skeleton. The obvious interpretation of this is that there's something, they're trying to ward off famine, that they're trying to ward off infertility in society and the infertility and failure of crops. But actually there's something definitely different going on, because a number of these figurines have been buried along with young children who've either been stillborn or have died very early after their birth. And we know that at this time, as I said, we're talking about 9,000 years ago, 1 in 2 children were stillborn or died within minutes of being born. So is there a possibility here that actually what this society is trying to understand this process and thinking that women are creatures who can give birth both to life and to death, and that you therefore have to keep women in society on side? And pretty quickly after this, we get the developments in this particular area of Turkey of the idea of these early goddesses, these kind of proto-goddesses, who then become basically the great-grandmothers of our goddesses, Aphrodite and Venus. And Venus and Aphrodite, again, you will all have heard of them. Most people think of them as these kind of fluttering love goddesses who end up on Valentine's Day cards and they have a kind of cute relationship with Cupid. No, 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 no. If you lived in the ancient world, you would have feared both Aphrodite and Venus, because for the ancients, these were creatures of love and of death, of sex and of suffering, of occasional peace, but also of war. And their many times great grandparents come from this region, and they're Inanna, Ishtar and Astarte, and they are these furious deities of war and death as well as sex and love. And you just wonder what's happening there. You know, is there this idea that this is what women are capable of? They're very dangerous within society. They're lovely at times, but they also generate the disruption of sex, and they bring with them death. So these are just kind of tiny examples that really remind me it really matters the stories that we decide to immortalize, and the stories that we decide to learn from, and the stories that we decide to share. So it really matters what histories we choose to tell, and also where we tell them from. So you'll have seen from that little clip that, you know, basically I love history, I'm totally passionate about it. And I think the role of the historian is to look for the gaps and try to fill in the gaps. So me and my team, when we're making films, we always try to go to places which aren't sort of obvious. They're not necessarily in the public consciousness or in the mass media. So we end up tracing what we think of as Western civilization, and I'm speaking about this very particularly because we're here, thank you to the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization, but we had a conversation before I came, and I said, actually, I think Western civilization orientates at all points of the compass, and it's really important to remember that. So on the trail of classical civilization, I end up in slightly unexpected places. So just have a look at this. I don't know if I'd love to know actually if anybody's been here or has got heritage. So immediately when you looked at this, you'd probably think this was in Greece or Rome, maybe in North Africa, where there was a lot of Greek and Roman influence. But as you can see from the label, this is in Albania. Are there any people with Albanian heritage in the audience? Or anybody that's been to Albania? No, okay. You've all got to go. Oh, somebody, hello, are you waving at the back? Hello, well done, well done. Have you been to Albania? Yes. Oh, amazing. And do you know this place, Apollonia? It's beautiful, isn't it? And everybody's got to go, haven't they? I mean, it's so... Forget, if you've seen the film Taken with Liam Neeson, all about Albanian gangsters stealing your teenage daughters, remove that from your minds and go to Albania. It's one of the most hospitable places I know. And I'm going completely off script here. It's so hospitable that they have this code of Bessa of hospitality, where the idea is that as a host, you could put out your life for a stranger, so not just for a guest who's friend or family, but somebody who crosses your threshold. And this is so extreme in Albania that during World War II, a number of Muslim families, particularly in cities called like Berat in central Albania, they would provide sanctuary to young Jewish boys, particularly young, the sons of merchants, who were then passed on this kind of train through Eastern Europe. I mean, actually, you know, as in not a physical train, but passed from one household to another. And so in Berat, at the end of World War II, there were more Jewish families in that city than there were at the beginning. And these were all families and individuals who'd been hidden from initially Italian and then the Nazi occupiers. So that's, anyway, I'm saying all this because I'm saying you'll have a lovely time in Albania. They really look after their guests in Albania. So this is Apollonia in Albania, and in 44 BCE, a young man called Octavian went there. And if any of you know your Roman history, you'll know that Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, is the man who will become Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And Octavian went to Apollonia because this was a city that was described by Aristotle and Cicero as one of the greatest and most beautiful cities on earth. And it was somewhere where you went to learn affairs of state, to learn rhetoric and philosophy, which is why he was there. But there's something else about Apollonia, that this is the same building from a different angle. And if you just look beyond me to that plain that you can see beneath, this is taken just at sunset. Albania also has naturally occurring petrochemicals, so petrol, natural gas, and bitumen, which was the kind of favoured petrochemical of the ancient world. And on that plain beneath, you can just about see it through that gap in the trees. There were extraordinary shrines where these natural flames, which burst from the earth, were worshipped in a sanctuary. So when you went to Apollonia, you had this kind of fire and light show going on around you. And because of this, it had this rather magical, supernatural, mystical feel. And we know that Octavian had a session with a soothsayer there, and I suspect, we know there was wine involved, got a funky feeling there might have been other substances too, but it all sounds very kind of heady, and Octavian says, what's my future? And the soothsayer says, your future is to conquer the earth. And young Octavian, at that moment, decides to get back on his ships, to cross the narrow stretch of water that takes you to Italy. He goes back to Rome, and he sets in train the Imperial Roman project. So the Roman Empire is born in Albania, and we forget that. We don't tell that story. Another place that you find unexpected Roman activity is right the way over, this is Italy, just in case you doesn't know where Italy is, right the way over to the green patch of land, which is what's now modern-day Azerbaijan. And we were in Azerbaijan, actually on the trail of the story of the Silk Roads and the sort of, that amazing connection, the series of routes that connected east and west. Right up at the kind of northeastern corner, which is on the borders with Russia. So we're on the borders of Russia and Dagestan. And oh my goodness, I've been to some remote places. This is pretty remote. You're in the greater Caucasus. It's wild and misty. Again, the Azeris are extraordinarily hospitable, but you turn up, at dawn for breakfast and a cup of tea and actually find that you are forced to drink at least 5 or 6 toasts of vodka before you have your tea. And if you don't, it's very, very offensive. So it was a bit of a haze, I say, the Azerbaijan trip. But I mean, again, amazing people. And we were looking for this Silk Roads, and as I was sitting in this official's, this kind of, very sort of post-communist desk, drinking this vodka at about 6:30 a.m., I said again, is there any new archaeology? And he got out, and you couldn't make it up, he got out of his drawer these Roman swords. And I recognised them as Roman swords. And I said, where did you find that? And he said, oh, well, this is, these were excavated about 15 years ago, but we've just discovered some more. So again, I said, okay, could I possibly come and have a look at this? And really interestingly, we know from the historical records that Romans operated here. So Pompey, the famous general, a one-time ally of Julius Caesar, had a campaign in the east, and we hear about this from Plutarch and Strabo, and we hear that he went into the Caucasus. He had a lot of trouble with local tribes. He was turned back. He actually met the Amazons as well, the kind of legendary, ferocious female fighters, and eventually returns through Armenia. But there's been no archaeological evidence of that. So I was pretty excited, went up to this very, very, very misty, muddy site, and you can see what was discovered here, this beautiful head, a bronze head of, you can see I'm quite excited, I get more excited in the photos as it goes on, of Medusa, who's the mythical Greek figure, sometimes called Gorgon, who has snakes for hair. And we hear in the historical accounts of Pompey's activity in this part of the world that he escaped only because a javelin was sent flying against his breastplate and bounced off and kind of removed some of the metal as it did. And what this is the decoration of a general or a centurion's breastplate. So I'm not leaping to conclusions. I don't think that this is necessarily Pompey's by any means. But if you have a look at this, I mean, it's absolutely, absolutely beautiful. But it tells us the Romans were here. And it also tells us, because this is a burial ground where the soldiers have been very carefully laid out, that they weren't all slaughtered, that some of them survived the battle because they have time to bury their fellows. There's actually a camp there, and it looks as though some of the Romans go back home and some of them stay there. And so there's a Roman gene that exists in Azeri culture, and it's sort of extraordinary to think that, isn't it? That we, again, think of the Rome as being something to do with the West. We think of the Roman heritage that you find in places like America today with the Republican Party and the Senate and the Capitol. But actually, the Romans, in a way, have more to do with that border of Russia and Dagestan than they do with the United States of America. I really was a hound with a scent by this point. So I found out that the Romans are there. I found out that there's a military burial ground. And then, as I said, we also hear that Pompey was attacked by Amazons who came down from the mountain. So again, I went back and I said, And you haven't found any graves of women, have you? And indeed they have. So here, this is a necropolis. It's a beautiful place in Ordubad. I actually had to get on a plane to go to this particular grave. There are about 100 graves here. A number of them are of women. And these are women that we know are fighters, and we know they're fighters because the skeletal evidence is such that they have arrows that have pierced them in their skulls. The arrowheads have been cut off, they've been patched out and sent back out to fight. They have wound marks on the front of their arms and on their shins, which if you're just a woman in a settlement, nearly always you have wounds on your back because you're running away. So these are women who are 100% definitely fighters. You also find them just over the border in what's now Armenia. And within these graves, we found these beautiful things. So these are, you can probably tell, arrowheads. And they're made of obsidian, which is a kind of volcanic glass. And we know that the so-called Amazons used arrows of obsidian. And again, if you look at the bone evidence, not only are their hips massively splayed, which shows that they spent a huge amount of time in the saddle, but also their fingers are very warped from the amount of archery practice that they're doing. And if these were just hunting women, they wouldn't be that deformed. These are women who are clearly on military campaign and on military exercise. So this was unexpected and very exciting, as you can see from this. I'm extremely excited to find this dagger that was left in the grave of a woman. This is very early. This is around 3,300 years ago. But the tradition goes right the way through to the 1st century and to the time that the Romans were operating there. And again, that night I went home, we were staying with 3 local women in this place called Kinalik, very, very remote. They don't even speak Azeri, they have their own language. And through a translator, I said, I've had the most amazing day. We've discovered all these weapons. Do you tell, slightly patronisingly, do you tell one another stories, these sort of myths of the Amazons that we hear about in the West? Do you talk of these ferocious female fighters? And these 3 generations of women, so a girl of about 7, the mother and the grandmother, kind of looked at me as if I was a bit mad. And I thought, this is really awkward, I'm really not judging the mood in the room here. And then the grandmother said, what do you mean stories? This is what my mother used to do. So my mother would cover her face and her head. She would dress as a man. She would take her weapon, and then she brought out the weapon from her house, and she would ride down to fight as a man on horseback. So suddenly, in that moment, the centuries collapsed, and it was a very random bit of history that was giving us clarity about the present and about the story of these women who are never, nobody pays attention to them at all. But it feels as though there's this extraordinary continuity through time. And I don't know whether it's chance or not, but it's really interesting in Azeri culture that they have vote swimming not as early as Australia, who leads the field, I know. When was it in Adelaide? 1894. I mean, extraordinary. In 1902, I think, elsewhere, isn't it? But 1918 in Azerbaijan, women are given the vote in this Muslim-majority country. So these are these bits of ancient archaeology and ancient history that help us to understand the present. And this obsession with Amazons in the ancient world continues everywhere. This is the decoration in a house in Ephesus. And I don't know if you can see the thing that looks like a kind of semicircular, lovely sort of finial up at the top there of the ceiling. That's an Amazonian shield. You find this form everywhere. You see, look again, this is these are graves in Jerash in Jordan. So kind of association with the Amazons for the ancients was really cool. And if we read the sources, it sounds as though they're all fantasy, they're all made up, and they're a problem. But actually, if you look at the archaeology, it's clear not only were there real women who really fought at this time, but also it was clearly a good thing to be associated with the Amazons. You know, it's a kind of interior decoration choice to link yourself to the Amazons. And that really tickles me when we think of how Amazons are very present in our own world today. So obviously in movies, in things like Wonder Woman was based on the Amazon story, the superheroes in Justice League, in video games like Rome Total War, and of course in the biggest online shopping platform in the world, Amazon.com. I think Jeff Bezos, I love this fact, he didn't actually know he was calling it after the Amazons. He called it after the Amazon River because the Amazon River he thought was kind of massive and exotic and influential, and you know, it ran for miles and miles and miles. But the Amazon River is called the Amazon River because of a 16th century Spanish explorer who went there and met fighting women who had bare breasts, and they reminded him of the Amazons that he'd read about in his history books, which is why the Amazon River is called the Amazon River. So it's just to show that we're hyper-connected across time. There aren't any Mexican walls that divide us in history. You know, the thread of history never really snaps. And I just couldn't resist showing you this as well. Actually, I have to say, when I sent the slides over, I got a message saying, "Did you mean to put in a slide of American drum majorettes?" Well, I did indeed, because I know that Trump loves American drum majorettes, and I wanted to put it in because if he's watching this lecture somewhere, he will know that actually drum majorettes draw their inspiration and form and costume, as you will see, directly from Ottoman military marching bands from the 13th century onwards. And I suspect Trump doesn't know that. So please, if you meet him, will you tell him? So I'm sharing these things, you know, not just as sort of pub facts, not just because they're, you know, it's a sort of parlour game of interest. But it feels to me it's really important that we admit that just as we live in a carbon cosmos where we all share carbon molecules, you know, it's been said many times before, but we are all made of the same stardust from the same universe, that there are these kind of carbon molecules of culture that continue through the world. And they exist both in real forms and also in forms of the genetic memory that we have within us. So just have a look at this. You all know what this is, of course, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Probably one of the most famous monuments of the ancient world, and still the most astonishing thing. I mean, people know that I've written about the Great Pyramid. I've been to it many times. I'm never not speechless with awe when I stand in front of it. So, you know, just have a look at that. 2.3 million limestone blocks used to create the pyramid. Many of them 15 tons of weight, and yet those blocks were being put into place every 2 minutes during the construction. It's the heaviest building ever created by human hands still, 6.5 million tons worth of weight, originally over 480 feet high, just 8 inches off absolute mathematical perfection, and just 1 degree off absolute true north. I mean, it is the most extraordinary building. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the construction of the pyramid and what it contains inside it. And I was there a couple of weeks ago. There are very exciting discoveries. There's a lot. Unfortunately, I'm so strictly under NDA. I will be assassinated if I tell you about it. But there. Watch this space. They're very exciting. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on inside the pyramid. But it is the most extraordinary thing. And we all feel connected to it, I think. You know, we would be horrified, I think, imagine and hope, if we heard there'd been some terrorist attack on the pyramid, or if it was the target of military bombardments. And yet, you know, we know that this happens often with heritage. Monuments are targeted very specifically because it's an attack on people's morale if monuments are destroyed. It's an attack on shared experience. So this really matters to us. But there's a reason why it matters to us, and it's not just fanciful. It's not just because we've all seen it in books, you know, since we were tiny, of this famous shape, which again, I'm going completely off script, but just, I love this fact. It's called a pyramid because the Greeks called it a pyramid. The Egyptians didn't call it a pyramid. They didn't know what that word meant. A pyramid in ancient Greek is a little cake that's that shaped. So the Greeks went to Egypt and thought, oh, that reminds me of those buns that we eat back in Athens, so we're going to call it a pyramid. For the ancient Egyptians, this was Mer, it transliterates as M-E-R, a place of ascension. It was this kind of super important place where the king was buried so that he could reunite with the universe. But the reason that we all think that we care about this, we're now understanding, is because genetically we're born with memory. This is, again, very, very exciting scientific research at the moment. We're physically born with memory. I mean, physically, we're born with memory in our genes. And we're also born with something called symbolic memory, that because our grandmothers, grandfathers have talked about the pyramid in an unbroken stretch of time across 4,600 years, we are born understanding this is something that matters to us, and even better than that, there's brilliant research being done at the moment by Swiss genealogical centre and genetic centre called Swiss IGenea, and they've run the data. And they tell us that almost everybody in this room will be descended either from a pharaoh who was buried in a pyramid or one of the builders who made it. So just take that home with you and think about that this is your ancestral heritage. And isn't that an extraordinary thing? So these things matter to us, and they mattered to the ancient world too. You know, we know that societies understood that their heritage, that their history mattered to them. And if you think about, you know, some of the most successful societies of history, so China in the 6th century BCE, Athens in the 5th century BCE, the Hellenic world, the Hellenistic world from around the 3rd century BCE onwards. These were all societies that never asked that question of themselves. What's the point of history? What's the value of history? They knew that it mattered. And they knew that it mattered so much that they set some of their greatest heritage down in a list. That I've just written a book on the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's a replica, it's not the original. But what I'm holding here is an exact replica of the first ever written list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which was a physical list, was written down in the city of Alexandria. I'm sure you're all perfect ancient Greek speakers, but you can see it's. I mean, this is the original ink on the original papyrus. It's a bit damaged, because that papyrus was used to wrap a mummified body on the banks of the River Nile. So, you know, we'll forgive it for being a little bit beaten up. But you can just see there in the centre of the frame the word 7, hepta in Greek. So this is the beginning of the sentence that tells us this is where was listed the 7 wonders of the ancient world, with the pyramids being the oldest and, as I said, the one that still survives intact. And it was set down as a list because that amazing, successful society knew that we needed to understand and care for our history. Now, the next slide on why history matters and why it counts. We just wanted to show you that this is the films that we make about history are watched in 120 countries around the world by over 2 billion people. That's quite a lot of people who are just interested in history. And I'm doing quite edgy history. I'm not just doing the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians. We're doing history from places like Albania and Bulgaria. It gets a lot of coverage. But what really makes my heart sing is the fact that when occasionally we post about history, we were doing a film about Pompeii and the new discoveries in Pompeii. And again, has anybody been to Pompeii? Is there? Oh, look at you. Oh, that's so impressive. That is at least 2/3 of the room. That's super impressive. So you all know it's an astonishing place with astonishing finds, astonishing treasures. Pompeii and Herculaneum together have just got the most, you know, again, mind-blowing artifacts. A whole carbonized loaves of bread, you know, beautiful earrings, handbags that women used, and you know, it's just the most extraordinary place. But for me, one of the most touching finds is this little tray of pigments, which was left by an artisan, probably an enslaved person, but an artisan who was in the middle of redecorating the frescoes on the inside of one of those beautiful villas in Pompeii. And it's just astonishing to me that they've survived with colours so true over close on 2,000 years after they've been buried by that enormous eruption. So I posted this, as you can see. And I suddenly noticed that my phone was going crazy. So bing, 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 you know, I thought, what's going on? And this is within about 20 seconds of posting, and you can see that Pompeii has suddenly started to go viral. It's even above chlorinated chicken, which, you know, really, and ambulance chasers, really tells us something. And this single post of these pigments went internationally viral. It then turned out, rather hysterically, that people were partly reposting it because they thought that Mount Vesuvius was erupting again and that there was going to be, you know, a kind of second cataclysm. But also it was shared because people had empathy with those painters whose lives were lost in the middle of their daily work, painting a beautiful wall in this city of Pompeii. Because that's the other thing that history allows us to do. It allows us to have extreme empathy, to care about people from whom we're separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. So in answer to that question, does history matter? Do we need it? What is the point of history? I would say it is utterly essential to us as humans. And I'll just share one more little bit of etymology, which for me really proves that. So I said to you that history is a Greek word that means rational inquiry. The origins of history are actually much deeper. So historiae actually comes from a prehistoric root, wid tor, which means a wise agent. And wid tor also gives us the word wisdom. So history and wisdom are umbilically linked etymologically, and wid tor, wisdom, is also connected to vision and visionary, and the fact that if we have wisdom we can see things more clearly. And this is exactly what Thucydides, the father of history, told us. He said that history exists so that we can see things more clearly. So I put out this bid to all of you in the room to help me champion the cause of history, because it feels to me that history is something that allows us to live not just in the noise of now, that it allows us not just to be obfuscated by opinion and slur and slander and sensationalism, but to live bathed in the light of wisdom and compassion and empathy, because history reminds us to remember to think better. Thank you very much.